G'day everyone. In a recent trout fishing video, I mentioned the GoPro settings that I was using, and I received quite a number of questions and feedback on those settings, and one person even asked me if I could make a video detailing the settings that I use on my GoPro Hero 9 to make my fishing videos. Right, now before I start, there's one thing you really need to know before you choose your settings on your GoPro or any film camera for that matter, and that is how much grunt has your computer got. There is no point in shooting at high frame rates or high resolution if the computer that you're editing with can't edit the footage anyway. So the information I'm going to give you in this video, although I use it on a GoPro, is applicable to any camera. Now, in that video, I mentioned 4K 30 and I mentioned 2.7K 60. Well, what does that mean? It's all a bit confusing. The 4K is the video resolution. Basically, it means it's 4,000 pixels wide on the longest border. It's actually about 3.85 or 3.8 or something, but it's just rounded up to 4K. 4,000 pixels on the longest border. 2.7K is a bit smaller. It's 2,700 pixels, or a little bit under. It's 2,600 and something. And they're measured on the longest border, and this is where it gets confusing. Standard high definition, which we call 1080, is measured on the shortest border. The longest border is 1920 by 1080, so that's a little bit confusing, but basically full high definition is 1920, 2.7 is 2,700, and 4K is 4,000. That's just the basic rule of thumb. So when I say 4K or 2.7K, I'm talking about the resolution of the image. Now when I say 30 or 60, I'm talking about the frame rate. So 4K 30 is 4,000 pixels on the longest border, 30 frames per second. I'm essentially taking 30 photos a second at that high resolution. 2.7K 60 means I'm taking 60 frames per second at 2,700 pixels or a little bit under. Now I find 4K 30 and 2.7K 60 to be pretty similar to edit. This GoPro takes 4K 60, but my computer doesn't like it. I've got a very powerful computer and it costs me a lot of money, but it's not powerful enough to edit 4K 60, and a lot of people's computers won't even edit 4K 30. So it's really important to understand how powerful your computer is. Now, they're the main two settings that I use for most of my adventures, 4K 30 and 2.7K 60. Sometimes I use different ones, and let me explain. 4K 30 being a bigger resolution gives me more ability to crop. So when I'm fishing and a trout swims up and attacks my lure, I can crop in further to capture the action. I've got more cropping power with 4K than I do with 2.7K or 1920. But in 2.760, the 60 frames per second, well, let's just say that most videos play at 30 frames per second. It's a little bit less, but we'll say 30 frames a second. If I'm shooting at 60 frames a second, then I can slow that down to 50%, and then it'll play at 30 frames per second, but at half the speed. So I get smooth, slow motion. I can shoot at 120 frames a second, and I can slow that to 25%, and that gives me 4 times slow motion, still at 30 frames per second. And in some of my videos, you may have seen where I've thrown my crane nets out, and they've just slowly hovered through the air. I've videoed them with this camera at 1080p, 240 frames a second, 240 photos per second. And that allows me to slow that down to about 12% and get silky, smooth, slow motion. Now, when I'm shooting at 4K 30, I will still slow that down to 50% for slow motion, which makes it about 15 frames a second. And instead of getting that smooth, slow motion, you start getting that jittery slow motion because there's not enough frames to play. Imagine if you slowed it down more, it'd be like pop, 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 pop. Just imagine if I wave my hand across the screen like that at 30 frames a second, it's going to look nice and clear. If I do it at 3 frames a second, it's going to go, That's not going to be very smooth at all. So basically, rule of thumb, 4K 30 for crisp, clear video quality, and also to afford more cropping. I can crop heavier on a 4K 30 footage than I can on anything else. 2.7K 60 for slow motion. If my computer wasn't as powerful, I would shoot at 1080 60, which is a lower resolution, but it's still 60 frames per second, and that's quite a popular option for a lot of people. Now, how do I know what to set it on? When I'm fishing for trout like to jump out of the water, I like to shoot at 60 frames per second so that I can use slow motion. I think when I start filming, I've got to ask myself, what am I going to want most today? Am I going to want 4K, high resolution, or is there a chance I'm going to want slow motion? So if I think slow motion, I've got to choose between slow motion and high resolution. If I choose slow motion, I go to 2.7K 60. Most of my yabbying videos are filmed at 4K 30 because there's no need for slow motion. There's not very much that I do in slow motion when I'm yabbying. And if I do sort of preempt a scene, say I want to get slow motion of me throwing the nets in, I'll slow it down and change the resolution to 60 frames or 120 or even 240 frames a second for that particular scene. Now, something else you need to bear in mind, and this is very, very important, is the available light. The faster your frame rate, when you start going up to 60 frames and 120 frames a second, not only do you need more power to compute or more computing power to edit, you need more light because the little shutter in there that's opening and closing 30 frames or 60 times a second, the more that opens and closes, the faster it needs to open and close. So the more light it needs to be able to get in because it hasn't got as much time to get the light in between shutters, if that makes sense. So when you use 60 frames a second, well, I only use it in bright conditions. I'll use it during the day on a bright day. Quite often when I'm Murray cod fishing, I'll shoot at 2.7 so that if I get a surface strike, a boof, I can slow it down and you can get the tail. But then as it starts getting dark, once the sun sets, I'll change it down to 30 frames a second to let that low light come in between the slower shutter. Because if I leave it at 60, the image quality, the ISO on the camera will automatically ramp up, adjusting the light sensitivity so that it can make the best use of the light that's coming in at that really high speed. So I will slow the shutter down in the hope that I can just keep the ISO down for that little bit longer in the twilight period. And then when it starts getting dark with the ISO, which is the light sensitivity, is going to change anyway. So folks, they're the settings that I like. 4K 30 and 2.7K 60, and anything outside of that is usually for preempted scenes like throwing crane nets. In a recent video I hurled a carp out into Lake Nillacuti and my wife Loretta wanted to get a photo of the sea eagle. That scene was filmed at 240 frames a second because I knew in my head when I filmed it, this is going to make great slow motion. Can you film it for me please? And we'll do it at 240 frames a second. There's a couple of other functions that I just want to briefly touch on before I finish, and that is horizon leveling and the wind filter. These cameras have a wind filter on them. You can, I've actually got this turned off. Now what have I got this on after my last scene? 4K 30, I've got horizon leveling turned off, and I've got the wind set to wind. With the wind sensor settings on here, you've got on, off and auto. On means that it's always on, it's always going to block the wind. Off is going to give you the crispest image, but it's also going to detect, and it's quite windy today, so it's also going to detect any wind. You're going to get that in the background noise. Auto is good in the sense that you get clear audio when it's calm, and then when the wind springs up, it blocks out the wind. But I don't like it because it makes the video bad to watch. It affects the viewing quality because the audio bounces around from noisy to clear to noisy to clear. I always use on. I have it set on. That way the audio is consistent all the way through. It's not as clear as off, but it's better than bouncing on and off. So I always have the wind setting turned on. And the horizon leveling is a great function in bright light. And what I've found in low light, you may see some of my videos flicker a little bit in low light, and that's because the horizon leveling, it must try and find the horizon and try and find something to focus on or something. I don't know, but it just looks really bad when the horizon leveling flickers. So horizon leveling is great in low light, but it is only available in linear mode. So if you like to shoot wide, you can't use horizon leveling. I usually use 4K 30 with the horizon leveling turned on, which I have now, and the wind on auto. And then when the light gets low later in the day, I'll turn the horizon leveling off. Sometimes I forget to turn it off and it still flickers. Sometimes I forget to turn it back on and I end up with a crooked video. And something that is a little bit funny, when I've caught a fish and it's laying on the ground and I pan down at the fish, because there's no horizon when you look at the ground, the fish sort of starts doing this. That's the camera inside trying to find the horizon. So there you go, folks. They're my settings. That's what I use. You use whatever you like, but just remember to make sure that your computer has the power to compute, to edit the video before you choose your settings. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, want to give it a thumbs up. Thanks very much for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in my next video.